So not tech savvy when it comes to these things. So the instruction. Did you need more PowerPoints?
Yeah, but it's fine.
I gotta walk out of this. Okay, so thank you all for coming today. So this is our excellent. I'm Jennifer Gates, and I'm the planning manager for policy and housing here at the city of Encinitas. And I think you have to do not registering. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so today we're going to have a developer roundtable discussion. This is one of our ways of collecting information from the community and from those that are developing within our community or outside our community, but also property owners, real estate, people in the real estate world for today to help us get more information about a specific plan, what is going on in the corridor, what's going on in the real estate world, as well as with housing and mixed-use development and retail development currently. Again, my name is Jennifer Gates, and then this is Melinda. So that's who's here. I think Pat was here a second. Oh, there he is. Pat's also here with the city. He's in the city manager's office, and he does a lot of our economic development work. And then I will let Brooke here introduce the rest of the team.
Thank you. I'm Brooke Peterson, so I'm with Rick Engineering. I lead up Rick's planning and design division, so I'm serving as kind of the overall project manager for the specific plan preparation for El Camino. I have Britt Palmberg, who's our principal economist, and then Mimi Murasaki, who's our deputy project manager. And then we have also Diego Velasco, who is our kind of designer, planner, architect that's working alongside with our team.
So as many of you know, we had a workshop for the community and gathered input at that meeting. And so this is just the next step, is to continue to gather information. I also did 2 pop-up events so far to gather more information from the community, which we will be presenting information that we have collected probably in January. So we're trying to finish collection this month. We did reach out to a number of different developers and such, and we, if there's others out there that we just don't know about that we haven't reached out to, Melinda and I are going to reach out to them and kind of follow up with the same discussion that you guys are going to be participating in today, which Brooke is going to leave. Unfortunately, I have to go to a briefing. So I just wanted to quickly just introduce myself and do the agenda, and then I hope to be back in time for the public comment section. But we're going to start out with just introductions of everybody here today, do an overview of what we're doing with the El Camino Real specific plan and why, what we're looking for, and then go into the roundtable discussion. And there are some questions around mostly these topics, but it can broaden as we have this discussion. And then we'll follow that up with the public comments, because obviously there's people from the public here today, and get some additional comments, and then we'll go over what the next steps are in this process. So I will be back. All right.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jennifer.
It's all her.
Okay, so if we could just go around the table here, and if you guys could introduce who you are, company, property owner, investor, developer, etc., that would be great.
Great. I'm Craig Kilman with JLL. I represent the ownership of the Encinitas Marketplace, the Kohl's Shopping Center on El Camino Real, and I've done quite a bit of retail work along the corridor. I've spent 11 years working on the Forum Shops in Carlsbad, even though it's right across the riparian from Encinitas. I'm very familiar with the market.
My name is Chris Roberson with Endeavor Real Estate Investments, a couple of development projects. Primarily, I'll do acquisitions and entitlements. That's kind of it.
I'm Chris Calkins. I'm with the Encinitas Ranch Town Center Associates. We own the plaza on one side of Leucadia and the town center on the other.
Okay, I'm Byron DiAracle. I am Consulting Director of Entitlement Planning and Communication for TRC Retail, and we are the owners of Encinitas Village and Camino Plaza Village.
Excellent.
Yep.
I'm Scott Grady, also with TRC, SVP of Development. I'll add, we also own Village Square, where this Swami's is next to it. It's his village, so we've got three centers in the corridor.
Brian Grover with Nolan Communities. Don't have any properties in the corridor, but we're either in the process of starting construction or entitling 550 units in the city of Encinitas across 5 properties. And so I understand affordable housing and kind of the market generally speaking in this density of housing. So.
Super. So I will just give you a little bit of background. We're preparing a specific plan for the El Camino corridor from just south of Encinitas Boulevard. So we're including the Sprout Shopping Center and the LA Fitness Shopping Center along the south, and then all the way up to Leucadia. And we're preparing a specific plan basically as an implementation action from the recently adopted housing element. This is the plan is an implementation of the goals and policies, and there's a couple housing sites that are identified in the housing element that are within the corridor. It's also, we received a grant to do the specific plan. The city received a grant from Housing and Community Development. So there is an intended purpose to the specific plan to hopefully look for opportunities to integrate housing, again, as the implementation of the housing element as well. Then there were some community surveys done at sort of the outset of this process, kind of before the consultant team was on board. So we've just done some initial research and work to go through those surveys. As Jennifer mentioned, we've done an initial workshop where we just really went through some of the existing kind of conditions information that we have compiled and analyzed, as well as heard from the community on what they see as opportunities, constraints, concerns, etc. So this is really, the meeting with you is to really, we wanted to hear from the market side of things to really understand what some of the barriers to doing more, or barriers to additional investment, or different types of investment. What are the opportunities that could exist, or what would better incentivize or make development more feasible. So it's really the conversation that we wanted to have with you today to then inform some of the specific plan in terms of what that might mean for development regulations, for implementation processes, for the land use plan, et cetera. So with that, I'm going to kind of jump into, I want to just give you a quick roadmap as to kind of the specific plan process as a whole. As I mentioned, we've done the opportunities constraints analysis and how to workshop. We're meeting with you today. From that, actually another item that we worked through and kind of talked with the public about at the workshop was just getting initial ideas on what a vision for the specific plan might be. So we are working on developing that. We'll then move into preparing a series of land use alternatives coming out of our conversation with you and primarily the workshop. We will come back to the public with those draft alternatives for input, and also do a visual preference survey on different types of development, uses, product types, etc. From there, we'll select a preferred land use plan, kind of probably a compilation and taking the bits and pieces of all those alternatives. And then we'll put that together in the specific plan. It will require an EIR, and then eventually we'll take that to the public in terms of that draft that's sort of the draft document, public review document. And then ultimately it will need to go to commission, planning commission, council, the public, and coastal. Yes.
And I might have this wrong, but I believe since this specific plan would be effectively rezoning these properties in the corridor, this is subject to Prop A and would require going to a vote of the people. Yes. So I think that's just important. As we have these discussions about what to do in this corridor, make sure that there's, something for the public to see as a benefit there, in addition to housing, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
It ultimately is going to be voted on.
Yep. So with that, I'm just going to launch us into the discussion. We wanted to kind of address a few topics today. We want to just kind of get your input on the market. market forecasts, market trends, et cetera. Talk through existing kind of the regulatory or city processes side of things. Talk through housing opportunities, and then lastly, parking. And of course, if there are other items, other relevant topics that we don't expressly ask about, please feel more than free to bring those up and ask about them. So, in terms of the market, just kind of starting with a high-level question: what conditions, from a market perspective, trends, forecasts, et cetera, would attract you to develop within the corridor? I know there's a mix of development and property ownership here, so to do more with the properties you have or to come in and develop, what sort of conditions would attract you to develop? I'm just going to put a couple out there, and then we can feed off each other and such. So just your thoughts on the future of the corridor given market conditions.
When you say develop, you mean housing, retail, any and all?
Any and all.
Yeah.
We have not gone any particular direction with identifying, other than what's identified in the housing element. There are a couple sites that are expressly identified for housing. That's the current Armstrong's there. But aside from that, it's open to your discussion. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that residential density certainly helps, right? I know as a retail owner, I mean, no one's building new retail. That's pretty much a fact at this point, not even speculative, but no new standalone retail. And so if you're left looking at mixed use, you've really got to have density to make it pencil, and to residential density. And certainly, if you're going to tear down existing retail and build housing or mixed use, you're not going to build two-story, and generally speaking, you make that work. Although I will say it's really interesting with townhome land values and single-family. I mean, just during COVID, the single-family market has gone so completely bonkers that the land values now are it's pretty remarkable. What you can get for fairly dense, small lot, single-family detached product. I mean, we've got a retail center in Northern California where a grocery store is not performing well. They're going to go away, and we just submitted an application for 40 single-family detached homes at about 15 DUs an acre, and the land value of that is actually higher than 50 dwelling units to an acre, 5-story multifamily. So things have flipped because the for sale market has gone so crazy, and so I think that just speaks to that's happened in the last 12 months.
Right.
So it kind of speaks to the fact that you can't really, you should let the market dictate, in my opinion, and not be so stringent on regulations. Give the flexibility to go 10 DUs or 15 DUs in the acre to 80, because you just don't know where you're going to be in the cycle. And so that's kind of, you're seeing multifamilies, very, very dense multifamily, 4 or 5-story wrap projects, that kind of stuff. There's less of it now being entitled, and you're seeing a lot more single family, townhomes, detached, attached. Like I said, because
have you seen the absorption
because that
rates?
absorption. And I'm a retail guy, so I really don't know what I'm talking about in terms of housing. But I just know as it relates to our shopping centers in California, we're getting a lot of phone calls from residential developers who want to partner with us, or we're actually taking some sites and entitling them, and we've had to kind of learn a lot of these things over the last, frankly, year and a half from scratch.
And in that partnership, are those residential only developments that you're entitling, or is that mixed use? Have you seen both?
Well, so far they're horizontal mixed uses.
Okay.
The one Scott just referenced is horizontal mixed use.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think, follow on broadly what he was saying, depending on how you decide to structure a specific plan, I think from a property owner's perspective, I think we would prefer seeing overlays versus a fundamental change to the underlying zoning, so we have some flexibility be able to adapt to the market. So for general commercial, let's say that remains underlying zoning, but you have you have an overlay that you can then execute a mixed-use, horizontal or vertical mixed-use project. I think, and to follow a little bit along what Scott said about in terms of flexibility on density, we're working on, we're watching the housing element update and general plan update in Whittier, where they rezoned one of our shopping centers to a mixed use, but they're tiering the mixed use. So the minimum, you have a minimum density of I think 30, but they'll allow you up to 60, and they tier it, and you can get to 60, and that's base density. You can get to 60 if you provide a community benefit. So there's tiering of densities within a mixed-use zone. So you're either mixed-use 1, 2, or 3, and that gives you some flexibility to kind of create some economies, provide a community benefit that's reasonable, obviously.
And could you give examples of those community benefits? One of my questions actually is like, what sort of benefits?
So what are they talking about? Maybe public charging stations for EV, public art, transit stop. Those were kind of public benefits. Maybe payment of an in-lieu park fee or additional in-lieu park fee.
Okay.
So those kinds of things. So rather than just saying, okay, you're mixed use, you get no more than 15 units to the acre, that kind of just throws a blanket over it, and you may not be able to execute what you want to execute. And so nothing happens, you just revert to the underlying zoning.
Right.
Well, to Brian's point, if it's not an overlay and it becomes a shift to the underlying zoning, then it becomes a taking. And you as a city, you're not going to be able to get out of your own way, because you're just going to be faced with a bunch of lawsuits relative to the taking of the shift in the zoning. So if you can preserve the general commercial underlying zoning and then do an overlay, to Brian's point, I think it makes it more seamless for what the future is going to be for the specific plan versus trying to take and go backwards to go forward.
You know, we've got all, or virtually the majority of ours are large format tenants, and our properties, the leases are long with lots and lots of options. So if, we've looked at the idea of transitioning some to housing. The only way that we could really even think about this is we need it to be in an overlay structure, something that gives us flexibility at the time. The other thing, there's two other things that sort of affect when we talk to tenants about market. There's a couple of things. One is when we talk with people about housing, there is the idea of mixed use, vertical mixed use in a suburban community like this is not a particularly economically successful model.
Right.
So, but the idea of a mixed use design that has not vertical, horizontal mixes, that is something. So if you were to put an overlay in and were to want it to be mixed use, we want that. The other thing, and this is something I'm concerned about, is the efforts to try to make circulation roads more accommodating to pedestrians and bikes and slow them down is a nice objective. But when you take a city that has as few circulation elements as we have, if you take a major one like El Camino Real and choke it to the place that we don't easily provide access, particularly for regional tenants, for regional customers, you're going to destroy the economic viability. One of the things about El Camino, and when I look at ours, is we probably have more retail than we need just for the Encinitas community. So if we don't have the ability to bring people in, and if people don't feel like they have the ability to get access, you're going to fail. And I think there's probably a balance, but I worry sometimes with some of the designs that I see to try to convert El Camino Real into something like what they're doing with Pacific Coast Highway, which would be disastrous.
Well, and you've seen
Fair
the
enough.
choke in practice in the last 6 months with the construction along El Camino Real to improve certain aspects of it, and then taking it from 3 to 2 lanes, 2 to 1 lane at certain times of the day, and it's just a disaster. And people are just consciously or subconsciously avoiding it. fortunately, that's behind us. But to your point, if it were a long-term implication, you're going to have long-term adverse effects.
I just think it has to be, you have to, as you approach those issues on circulation, it's wonderful to try to improve it as a multimodal, but if you're trying to do something to preserve the economy and trying to make that a viable area, you've got to be very cautious about the extent to which you damage really our only north-south circulation.
Just
Yeah.
since we're, oh, go ahead.
As the housing guy, I would just, I agree with elements of that, but I'd say also if you want to introduce high density housing to the corridor, you do need walkability, bikeability. You can't expect those new residents, and I do completely agree, it needs to be more horizontal mixed use rather than vertical mixed use. That corridor just doesn't really support stacked mixed use, but if you want 40, 50, 60 units to the acre, which you're going to need to keep below a certain height, otherwise you're never going to get public support, you're never going to get coastal commission support. Those people aren't going to be, you're going to have a lot of people that don't want to drive a lot. They're moving there because they want to be able to walk to the grocery store, bike to the grocery store, bike to the restaurant, and not having that infrastructure is going to kill the housing that you're talking about building. So it's a total balance. I think you got to strike it right in the middle.
And you brought up a particular density range for the corridor. What amount of housing? I'm getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but when we get to housing, but what sort of amount of housing do you think is appropriate for the corridor? What would oversaturate it, et cetera?
Are you talking about total numbers, or are you talking about density of units?
I think density of units.
Are you talking about base density, absent state density bonus?
No, the ultimate build-out
Okay,
condition.
the ultimate build-out.
Mm-hmm. What would function and be feasible?
Well, my comment to that is feasible is that it's likely going to be too low a density to tear down the existing cash flow you have.
Yeah.
So I think we're all quiet because you ask us, like, where's the value? It's density. So you're not, the hard part for you is you're going to have to go to the public, and they're going to want to see renderings of, 2-story buildings, but nothing's going to get built.
But
So,
I think density and height are two different things, right? You can
But-
Yep,
achieve
exactly.
50 units to the acre and 3 stories if you make micro units. So we need to talk about density and height as part of the same discussion, right? Number of
Yeah.
stories, whatever
Yeah,
you
so-
want to use as your metric.
Yeah, point being though is that it's going to be tough for you to get the density you need to actually make something happen. Because if it's going to get voted on by the public, it's too low.
And I hear that. I think sort of upfront of that point, we're just trying to understand from a market perspective the types of housing, the amount of housing that seems feasible from a market perspective, what that would look like.
Yeah, I guess I'll go with numbers. If I'm getting 10, 20 grand a month of cash flow, and then I have to go back into evaluation of what that land's worth as an existing asset, and then you put 40 to 60 acre, and I work backwards on what the value of that is as a development site, it's gonna be tough to make any changes.
Fair enough.
Like the 40, like the lower density looks really cool or looks good on a rendering, and it helps to get the vote through, but it doesn't really do much change. But to these guys' points, where if you do the 40-60 and then you overlay something else over it, and then there's incentives to where you are providing the community with benefits, then maybe you can go more dense or higher.
So
The number 60 is in my head, but I'm sure that's going to freak some people out. And like he said, when you've got a 30-foot limit under Prop A, that's very tough to achieve. So
I definitely recognize it's going to be a balance.
Right.
Balance
But-
is going to be the key word across
Like
this whole thing.
what number of story, and I'm not the commercial guy, I'm the housing guy, so it's kind of educational for me to understand too. Like
I mean,
60 units per acre. If you're doing 400 square foot units, micro units, you can achieve that in 3 stories.
You
So
probably could, but then we wouldn't want to see a city requirement that you have to have ground floor retail on that.
yeah, understood. And I wouldn't build those units. So
Right.
I think it's important to be transparent about. Are you guys talking 3, 4, 5, 6 stories? What realm? I mean, if I put a consultant hat on, we're doing projects all over San Diego County in the 4, 5, 6 story range where we're redeveloping shopping malls all over the place for big owners like Brookfield and companies like that. So I think it's establishing, that's what you're asking, right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
what's the realm of height? I think you need to figure out first, less about density, more about height.
Yep. And context is important. You're talking about,
Yep,
we're looking at some of the
absolutely.
projects in Whittier, we will be looking at 4 and 5 and 6 stories. But,
Yeah.
right now, we have obvious limitations in the corridor
Yeah.
in terms of height than what you can achieve in density. The other thing I would just add in real quick is once you get through all this and you start looking at your allowable uses in this overlay, that you include uses that aren't now included for, let's say, general commercial, like medical uses, so people can walk down and
Okay.
go to a doctor, or walk down and go get their teeth cleaned, or whatever it is, get their eyes or so. So a lot of medical uses that aren't allowed in general commercial zones are gonna be really important in mixed-use settings, because then you have residents serving retail.
Byron's got a really good point there. So a lot of the code is really dated in terms of what is what requires a CUP.
Okay.
So we're just constantly battling this, not just in the city of Encinitas, but all over the place, because everyone's working off 1990 code
Okay.
or older. And so it's like at a drop, half of our tenants now require a CUP. And that's a daunting deal when you walk in, they want to open a business, and it's like, 9 months to get a CUP
Yeah,
and a traffic
yeah.
study
Yeah.
and 3 permits and a coastal development permit. And they're like, what? I just want to open a coder school.
And that's
right?
mainly due to the use.
That's the use.
Yeah.
So we've been working with staff a lot over the last 4 years in Encinitas on, it's like we almost have to preempt it before we don't even want them to walk into any city. We're like, we need to make sure we have this conversation with this person, because if you walk to the counter, you're just going to be told CUP, and 12 months later you'll have a business license.
Right,
So
right.
it's,
What are some
Well,
of
you-
those uses though that you're expanding into? Because this goes into market forces and talked about retail on the decline, or we're
just
not
a
seeing
lot more
growth.
service, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
so fitness uses,
Yeah.
medical uses,
Tutoring.
or instructor-based uses, like, a Pilates studio.
Yeah.
I have a specific example right now. I've got a
Those kinds of things.
day spa massage guy that I've been working with for 6 months
Yeah.
at the Encinitas Marketplace in the Kohl Center, and it's a massage parlor. I mean, the city thinks it's a massage parlor, and that goes back to your point about it's dated. It's not a massage parlor. It's a legitimate operation. It's a franchise or multiple units across the country, and it's going to be fabulous, and it'll be a great community amenity, but it's a conditional use permit because it's got to check all the boxes that it's not a massage parlor.
Make sure you got medical in that list.
I do.
Well, it
Okay.
isn't on the
Fitness,
screen.
medical, health,
Tutoring.
tutoring, yes.
Right.
And I understand from his perspective, economic development stuff, you can't just replace all your sales tax generating uses, but you need to kind of expand the bubble a little bit.
Right.
And a lot of times when you come through with an application, the jurisdiction may want to see a leasing strategy for that site. So what percentage are you gonna be, personal services that don't generate sales tax versus retail generating sales tax?
Which uses are you seeing on the decline?
Product-oriented retailers that
Yeah.
are
Small product, yeah,
that are impacted by the internet. I mean, everybody in this room can get commodities by pushing a button. You never have to leave your house, and with $5 gasoline, you'll want to drive all over town to try to find a commodity. The product-oriented retailers that are going to survive in the future are retailers that are going to sell products that require discretionary dollars and need to be touched and felt. A cashmere sweater at a nice shop at the Forum Shops, for example. People will drive there to experience that. But if I need a roll of toilet paper, I'm going to go to Amazon and just have it delivered. So it's a really strong experiential product-oriented retailers are the ones we're all striving to find. And they're right now a needle in a stack of needles.
You asked a question earlier about density. For what it's worth, we did a little study to see what happened, and we figured we needed to get a 40 DU to the acre minimum to make sense out of converting. So,
Okay.
for what it's worth.
That's helpful.
And you
Very
can't do
helpful.
that. I mean, despite the micro units, I think are fine as an element, but you're really talking about things that are more traditional, and you really can't get 40 DU without going up.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
I would second that. We kind of, at some point, looked at all the Encinitas assets and bifurcated, we broke them up into small shops and anchors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the small shop space, if you're getting, I speak in annual rents, that's sort of the way the world we live in, right, Craig? So, if you're getting rents that are $40, $50, $60 a square foot annually, then it's very, very difficult to tear a perfectly good retail building that's at 20 to 25% land coverage. It's really hard to tear that down. It's just, the economics don't make a whole lot of sense. If you've got a retailer paying you like $15 to $20 a square foot on a big box, maybe a 50,000 square foot box, the inversion of the land value starts to get closer, but you're still like, it's not quite there. I mean,
That brings us back to the density question.
It's kind of like, I don't know, you may disagree with me, but we looked at this 2 years ago, before we spent $10 million renovating Encinitas Village. We're like, wait a second, should we be tearing part of this down?
Yeah.
Right?
No,
and so at the time, it was like, yeah, we'd have to get to about 50 or 60, and that was when micro units weren't maybe as popular. We were just looking at a 5-story wrap project, because doing a podium didn't make sense. It would have had to have been wrap, and even then it still didn't make sense. So, I mean, but we were like, maybe in 10 years, if the box rents stay really flat or decline, and rents keep going up in Encinitas, and by some way we knew with Prop A you couldn't get the height.
Got it.
Maybe by that time, we're like, maybe it would make sense, so.
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Scott, and I think, one thing you said made me, and maybe it comes back to the goal of this exercise, right? But I think if I put my resident hat on as an Encinitas resident, the last thing that residents want is to lose all of that retail, all of those commercial
Right.
uses. They would never vote. I would never vote for that. So I think it's all about how do we get assurances that retail is going to stay in this corridor, but also bring in, other uses like housing and have people living in close proximity to commercial retail uses. And that's less about tearing down and more about like better use of parking lots. So for example, we're doing a 44 unit to the acre project in Encinitas, not micro units, in 3 stories with 1 level of subterranean parking wrapped.
Right.
So,
And that's
if
you doing taking advantage of a parking lot location?
No,
Oh,
no,
okay.
and it doesn't have a retail component.
Okay.
But this would be, if I picture like some of your shopping centers where you have a big parking lot in the middle,
Yeah.
if you ran the numbers and if you can go 1 or 2 levels subterranean, not remove any of your retail,
Right.
but bring some things closer to the street and incorporate housing to a
Right.
certain height, that might be, win-win for everybody and something that the public could support.
Yeah, we're definitely not, there's not a purpose or an intent to the project to take away. It's really about how do we infuse, yes, housing, because that's what's been called for by city adopted housing element, and what else could be infused to create a balanced future. So it's not intended to be a taking away.
Yeah, one thing Chris mentioned when he was introducing himself regarding the Encinitas Ranch Town Center is that they've got medium to large format retailers with long-term leases and lots of options, and those leases also have restricted use, covenants in those leases to preclude the landlord from touching
Right.
parking fields, ingress egress points or whatnot,
Yeah.
and that's going to be a monumental horse trade when you want to adopt something like you just mentioned, going into the middle of Target's parking lot. It's a top 10% Target in the country. Going into the middle of Target's parking lot, and you're kind of sitting in a catbird seat because you got the largest piece of property on the corridor, but you probably are your hands tied as tightly as anybody does.
Yes.
So it's so easy to sit at this table and speak fundamentally about what we could do, but the reality of it is it's so complicated.
Yeah.
Understood. I just
Yeah.
appreciate the ability to at least talk about the fundamentals, help us understand the particular context of the fundamentals in the corridor, and work from there,
The
understanding
more,
the
the more
complexity for sure.
flexibility you build in, that's why overlays are a good thing.
Yep, yep.
That allow for a fairly rapid consideration. Rapid in the real estate world is not rapid, but it's, you know, then you may be able to, in a serious downturn, get people to look at some of these ideas.
Yeah,
Right, so
and that
it's-
also then speaks
yeah.
to Brian's point about not necessarily, the purpose is not to take away. The overlay allows to basically integrate, allows the flexibility to integrate.
Plus, if
Yeah,
a box
sorry,
goes
no
dark,
problem.
if a box goes dark for a year or two, and you're still then looking for those options, it provides flexibility.
Mhm. If I can take us back to kind of regulations, existing policy regulations in the city, whether that be general plan, zoning code, or permit processing, are there other existing kind of regulations or processes that are particular barriers that present an opportunity to try and address, resolve?
I'll give a specific example. The Sylvan Learning Center has been in the Encinitas Marketplace for 15 years. And they were in too large of a space, so they were kind of going under based on their occupancy cost. And we negotiated a deal to move them into a smaller location that they could operate out of and bring their occupancy cost down to what they could afford. The city of Encinitas required them to go through a brand new conditional use permit, a brand new parking study, a brand new environmental impact
less than
study.
10 years.
It took, right, yeah, to move in the same shopping center to a smaller location to service the community, as if they weren't in the community at all. I even sent Catherine Blakespeare an email, and I said, Catherine, this is insane. And she responded back, and she copied all the planning people and all their outside consultants, and they all came back and said, she said, I'll do what my consultants tell us I need to do, and they all came back and said, you need to apply as if you were a brand new tenant coming into the community. I'm saying, of course we do, because you're going to get your fees and all the things that are associated with that, but it made no sense whatsoever. Sylvan went through it. It took 9 months, got them open for business. They're happy in their new location, but it never should have happened that way.
Okay, processing issues, okay.
So it's
Anything
cost of
else?
studies, a lot of studies,
A
analysis.
huge amount of studies,
Well,
and
Well, that's-
landlord loss of rent in the new location, and
Look, this Encinitas isn't Santa Monica, but it tries to be in some ways. And there is very little trust in the public in the work of staff and others. So the result is we have a staff that is basically hamstrung about making decisions. They have no they basically don't have any discretion. So when you've got anything that's going to require judgment, it's got to go through what amounts to an extremely onerous process of constant review, feedback, and there ought to be some place to moderate that.
Okay.
It certainly makes it difficult for smaller towns. I mean,
Okay.
it's just
Yeah.
a very expensive process.
Okay.
yeah, the staff has all the responsibility and none of the authority to get any of this
Right.
done.
Okay. Do you mind introducing yourself really quick? just
Yeah,
so people around the
sorry.
table? No problem whatsoever, just
Sorry,
so we
I'm
know.
late. Jameis William. I'm with Merlone Geyer Partners. I grew up in Encinitas and I live in Encinitas, but my firm is owner operator of about 16 million square feet of retail shopping centers, and I redevelop old retail shopping centers. I have 2 projects here in San Diego, 1 in LA and 4 up in Seattle right now. And so we look at and redevelop those properties that are located in specific plans, right, where communities want to see more density. They're trying to accommodate growth in the right way, and usually they have paved the path through a specific plan or a community plan update, and we work with our tenant relationships to buy out leases and compensate business owners for relocation and pave the path for redevelopment. So I have about 8,500 multifamily units right now in various stages of development, and I have a partner with about the same number.
And that's all within kind of repurposing existing shopping centers?
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
super.
And so, I also, I grew up here, and my kids all are going to school at LCC and DeGano and Capri, and I've seen sort of the conversations going on, and I think there are ways to still preserve Encinitas the way that we want it to be and meet these onerous requirements that are coming from Sacramento to provide housing without, overburdening our neighborhoods that we want to keep quaint and cool. And I think looking at El Camino Real is the right thing to do. So I'm here to share some thoughts and lessons learned.
Sounds great. Thank you.
You got it.
You missed the density and land value conversation.
You guys are
If anybody here knows the math, Seamus knows the math.
Yes, and I guess one other thing, at my prior firm, I was with Kilroy. I developed one Paseo down in Del Mar, and went through a pretty hairy entitlement process there.
17 years later.
Yeah, it took a lot of years out of my life, but the outcome now is good, and yeah. But yeah, we could talk about densities and land values or whatever, depending on where we're at in the conversation.
Sounds good. Maybe I'll just finish out at least looking at sort of regulatory barriers. Aside from regulatory barriers, are there others, like whether it be site constraints, site configuration, infrastructure limitations, or otherwise that present particular barriers? I think I've heard a lot of themes as to the key barriers, but I just want to make sure we flesh anything else out.
Well, I think the stormwater regulations are just really, I don't know, there's a whole lot that Encinitas is going to do, because I know that's coming down from the county.
Yeah.
But I think just having, a solid understanding at the city level about what they can and can't do is important, and it's just a lot of extra cost.
Okay.
On top of what are already difficult economic decisions.
So if I can bring up a touchy subject on what I'll call potential impediments or restrictions, is bring up Prop A again. So I'm on the Planning Commission in Costa Mesa. We have a similar measure, Measure Y, that we're kind of dealing with right now, figuring out how we get our housing element certified. Because it's in the general plan amendment that's going to have to go along with that, various elements where we've already got a legal opinion from our city attorney that we have to put that whole general plan amendment housing element in front of the voters, and the problem that's going to cause with HCD and the eventual trains that are going to meet on the track going in the same direction.
Good analogy.
But some of the things we're thinking about is, are there areas in the city where Measure Y, and this again I'm referencing Costa Mesa, but I'm doing it in the context of Prop A.
Yeah.
Are there regions within the city where that Measure Y could be modified where it doesn't apply or it is less restrictive? Are there any provisions in Prop A that would allow you to go from 30 to 40 feet in certain areas? And I know that requires a modification of the measure, and that has to go. But those kinds of things. The 30-foot restriction is really, really, a stack of bricks on anything that can get done that's economic, that allows the city to kind of achieve its RENA allocation in that corridor, or have the corridor contribute to your RENA allocation. And particularly in the context of, if you're trying to get economies and you're trying to exercise density bonus law, or you meet your inclusionary housing requirement, whatever it is, that 30 feet is going to be tough to do, in my opinion. I just,
Absolutely.
There should be, and this, it's a bright community and they know what they love and they want to keep their community, but there should be some areas where, okay, can we accommodate a little bit more height in certain areas? Contextual. Think of it contextually rather than being citywide. Livenhain, yeah, you're right. You don't want 50, 60 foot buildings, but you may allow, think 40 or 45 feet or whatever it is in the corridor that creates. You have to be really careful about creating a place that just can't be these walls, and it's a concrete corridor and it's just cars flowing up and down it. But complete street concepts, pedestrian and bike trails, taking shopping centers like ours and creating small communities where it's there's a maybe a 40 or 50-foot residential component, but it's all residents serving retail. Maybe you have an Anchor or a small grocery, a Sprouts or a Whole Foods, and some residents serving, and so that center is kind of a small town right on the corridor. Doesn't mean other people can't come to it, but
You're kind of answering one of my other questions was going to be like, what is an ideal parcel? So you're speaking
it's really
to at
creating
least
a small
one
community.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, that's why I said allowing medical uses in that, what isn't normally allowed in without a CUP or if at all, in a general commercial zone. So that the people that live in these units all go downstairs and they can get all their daily business done. They don't have to get in the car. If you got some cafes or some interesting little restaurants or whatever. So anyway.
So funny, we come full circle because that was 30, 40 years ago, kind of a European model. And then we went the other way to
Right.
these massive community
Sprawl,
power
and
centers.
sprawl, and, yeah,
and there was a
right.
place for that.
Right.
Now we're kind of trying to come back to a place that's more community oriented.
Still, there's a tendency, though, when you see horizontal mixed use, particularly residential, being injected into retail or in close proximity, there's a tendency to wall them off.
Yes.
Right? So you could, right there, that you can't get to. Just then have to come back to the corridor, which is already traffic choked, and then get back in. So that does go to a question about constraints in terms of access and the ease of movement and what you all are dealing with in that regard. Because I'm sure that, you're taking an area and turning it into residential. You've got, you're underwriting that differently than you do with retail, and you've got different requirements. But if there's a way to have it all kind of mixed.
Right, so when you guys say horizontal mixed use, are you thinking like Diego is where it's integrated, you can walk from the grocery store to the nearby apartments?
I think the challenge with the horizontal mixed use, you need, if it's an integrated project, you need a lot of land. Like
Yeah.
you need a large parcel for that to occur. If you're trying to do it isolated in a corridor, I think setting up a specific plan or someplace where there's the capacity to be more vertical, where you're not blocking views, and allow the adjacent parcels to then respond to where the demand is to provide those types of services. That's kind of how organically I've seen it evolve well. Like, to your point, I see something like, the self-storage facility that was just built across from Taco Bell. That's a perfect location where there should have been high-density housing. If there was a plan in place to allow for it, you're not blocking views.
Mm-hmm.
It's right next to services and goods and transit. If that was allowed for, that's what it would have been, and it would have pulled that out of the RENA requirements instead of it. The city scrambling to figure out where they can put more units elsewhere in the city, which no one wants, right? So I agree with you. There should be specific locations where you can add more density, and more density. Most people driving by a well-designed multifamily project, they can't tell the difference from 40 feet versus 50
Right.
or 75
Absolutely right.
feet even, as long as it's designed
Absolutely
well.
right.
But that difference can be the difference of a project penciling or not, because all the cost is in the parking structure and the podium.
Right.
And you make your money on the units that you're building out of the stick frame. And if you can only build two frames, just two levels of wood frame, but you're building all your cost into your podium, it's just not going to pencil. And so you're going to see a self-storage facility get built instead of housing.
One of the things that may help the community envision what a corridor with a little more height and density would look like, maybe in some corridors, you go to a form-based code context where you can actually see what the potential structures would look like rather than having it be just the base numbers of it's this FAR, it's this density, it's this.
Right.
If you do form-based code, then you're giving people something to look at and get excited about and get to know a little bit better rather than be afraid of it. It's not a monster. You can make it look really nice. And we have a project up in El Cerrito in the East Bay. And El Cerrito has a really, really nice specific plan called the San Pablo Avenue Specific Plan. It just updated. It's all form-based code, and it's really successful. They've got people piling in there to do projects.
Okay, so successful from a development standpoint, do you have a sense of the success from a community satisfaction with
There's
what's
no
being built?
community resistance to any of these projects. It's fascinating to watch, and these apartments are getting leased up like this. It's really amazing.
One thing that I've just been thinking, listening to the discussion, there was a housing plan several years ago called At Home in Encinitas, which was later referred to as Measure T and voted down by the public, but that was a form-based code and it was largely focused on this corridor. So I think as a starting point, that would be a good place, especially for Diego to take a look at a lot of the principles in the At Home and Encinitas plan. I thought were very good form-based code principles. I understand why it didn't pass the voters, and ultimately we moved to Measure U, but we're kind of coming full circle and re-looking at this corridor for redevelopment. I also think it might be, we just sort of started talking about all this stuff, but it would be good to understand, like, what is the city's intent? What's the intent with this project? Right now, it sounds like all these commercial centers are operating just fine, and they would need an incentive to include housing, but the public's going to want to understand what the benefit is for letting residential in there. So it would be good to establish, like, what is the goal of this project? Is it to encourage more multimodal transportation in the corridor, to get more housing in the corridor, to satisfy the city's RHNA obligations? What's the city trying to accomplish with this specific plan? Otherwise, we're just talking about adding housing.
Yeah, I would say it's first and foremost the RHNA and housing element implementation. So there's a number of units that need to be built. So, and that's the purpose of getting the HCD funded the grant, et cetera.
But the public's going to look at that and say, we just went through this for 5 years. We did Measure T, we voted that down, we voted Measure U down, then a court imposed it. Now we have a 5th cycle housing element, we have a 6th cycle housing element. We don't need more. That's what some would argue. Now others would say, well, you've got SB 166 with no net loss, that's going to get triggered at some point. But right now, looking at this space and time, the RHNA obligation has been met with the 5th cycle housing element and the 6th cycle. So,
and some of that is slated to be in the corridor. Obviously not all of it.
Yeah, Armstrong, right?
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. But some of it.
And I'm just trying to put on the hat, like, ultimately this is going to need to go to the voters, so it's important to vet it.
Is there opportunity, given what is there, are there places that could be retrofitted, improved? Like, I keep using the word infused.
I think to your point, I don't think everybody was very stoked on the outcome of where the housing was getting spread based on the housing element, and this is a way to make it even better, right? And the rules of the game have changed. Sacramento is just forcing us to make different decisions than we did even 2-3 years ago.
And I know that's some of where the city's coming from. Is like I
think that's the point. It needs to be communicated to the citizens that, look, we don't necessarily want to ram this down the city's throat, but we're up against, we're going to have this collision again with with housing development, and we need to proactively think differently. We can't just vote down something again because.
And is there a way to do it that achieves the community benefit and maintains the community character? That it's not just ramming some mass monster through. That's not the goal. The goal is to figure out how to do something that integrates into the community, not supplants it.
But again, keep in mind, 2 initiatives were voted down when it was required by state law. This isn't required by state law. So how do we get it passed? That's where we need to start, right? Like, what is the public benefit?
So it's not required, but it is an implementation tool, she says, but if it is structured such that it is perceived by the state to be an impediment, then you have a problem.
That is true too.
And it's going to be a requirement eventually,
in 7 years,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, it is. So
right.
we don't want to just wait and be reactive. We need to be
very, very true.
Did the prior effort to spread housing everywhere, or did they try to do some of the?
They tried to let each neighborhood kind of take their own dose of the medicine, which I think was the wrong approach. It should have been based on good urban planning principles, focusing housing and density next to goods and services and transit.
Which is really El Camino corridor. So in terms of the principles of
and
that,
parts
it
of
seems
Encinitas
like
Boulevard.
Yep.
This may seem like a bit of an extreme example, but when you talk about increasing the height limitations that are based on coastal commission, it's one thing to join the Paris Climate Accord, but unless you've got Russia, China, and India as part of it, you know, are you really benefiting anything? The example would be that we can all talk about it before it would even go to a vote. I mean, the Coastal Commission would have to be on
Yep.
board
Yep,
with whatever
absolutely.
we wanted to do before it ever even got to a vote in Encinitas.
Yeah, and the last thing anybody at this table wants to do is spend, you know, where's that scheduled, 2 years going through the CEQA process and having public workshops, baking a cake that the public's not gonna support. I mean, that
Right.
wouldn't be good for anybody.
Yeah, and I mean, that is part of the hope of this, is that we can bake the cake through this specific plan process.
Yeah.
So that it does facilitate better implementation and better development, that's more streamlined, because we've done the work to work through it here, through this plan.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I thought Measure T was a great plan. Not just the sites, but the form-based code within it. I thought it was very well thought out, very well, you know, public workshop through the city back in 2016, and it didn't pass. And I think many of the, you know, Prop A folks would probably agree that that was a better housing plan than what we ended up with Measure U, for the reasons that you mentioned. It was based on putting density where it should be located, rather than where HCD says it should be located, 51% vacant or underutilized properties, et cetera, the new rules that were established in 2018. So now it's just going back to essentially Measure T, which is this corridor. How do you show it as a public benefit, given that it's not required by the state from a housing standpoint? And if we can figure that out and, you know, maybe involve the public in those discussions, we might have something that can go to the voters and get supported.
I think a great kind of the next thing you would think about is, okay, where's that development going to occur? Why does it make sense on El Camino Real? From our perspective and what we've seen, retail's changed.
Right. We've talked about it briefly.
Retail has changed significantly, and I don't think that's missed on anyone, right? I mean, the mainstream media has talked about the retail apocalypse and Amazon's changing of the retail environment, and by changing the land use associated with retail, you're giving businesses that are struggling an out, because they may have leases in place, and you know, I as a developer can come in and look at a plan that's in place and say, hey, the land residuals for multifamily are worth X. I can afford to write this business a check to go away, and they're going to be happy because they're going to make more on that than they will running their business, right? It comes down to dollars and cents when you're dealing with businesses, as opposed to going into these residential communities where then it's a different conversation, right? So I think a lot has changed since 2016 in regards to where's retail. Do we need as much retail as we have along El Camino Real? No one in this room can answer that question, but the market can sort that out, right?
Which is why the concept of the overlay allows for the flexibility to adapt to those
Exactly.
trends.
That's the key, is you put the overlay in place and you let the market do its thing.
Yeah, I mean, 6 months ago, if you told us that CVS was going to come out and say they're closing 900
Yeah.
stores nationwide, I would have been like, no way. They're strong, you know, they're one of our very strongest tenants. I mean, but their whole business model's totally changed. I mean, they're a healthcare provider. You know, their retail is just a blip on the balance sheet at this point. They've continued to expand into other service lines. So if they can't provide back to services and medical, if they can't provide medical services on site, and you know, and they make money on prescriptions, but you know, selling bottled water is not really working out for them. So
And shopping centers are usually
so-
what? You're usually at like 35% site coverage with your
At
buildings. It's all
best, right.
surface parking. So where do you want to put your density? Where does it make sense?
Yeah.
Well, that's a great segue. I was going to actually ask about parking, and you know, we've talked about density, we've talked about uses, but is parking ratios, are there opportunities there?
I think you let the
Are there
market
other-
figure it out. I mean, no developer is going to get financing for something that can't be parked, and
Exactly.
it's going to change over time as technologies change for parking, as more people adopt, you know, public transportation as that improves. But I don't think you want to get too carried away with putting parking requirements of any, you know, particular nature. I mean, obviously there will be parking until
Right.
there's no longer a need for parking.
Yeah.
But maybe instead of having this, you know, the formulaic 4 per thousand or whatever it is,
Mhm.
that the parking requirement for a project is established by analysis and study, or parking utilization studies from other similar uses, rather than, this is the code, you've gotta have this many spaces.
Right.
I'd rather have a real world application of what the parking should be based on analysis. In fact, we should go
At
and
the
become,
time an
we should go and
application is-
become traffic engineers,
Yeah.
because you're gonna have work coming, more work than you know what to do with over the next 15
So not to
years.
play devil's advocate, but you're suggesting that would be done at the time an application comes
Yes.
through? Okay.
Yeah. Well,
You know,
one-
that's
one
fine
stall
for
per
larger
bedroom is
projects.
usually-
I mean, that's actually one of the barriers is.
That's
if
what
you
I
have to
was
do a
kinda-
traffic. So I think the idea of moving away from as tight the city really should be revising its rules is what it should do, what its criteria is. It shouldn't be putting that burden on somebody who's opening a 5,000 square foot
Well, I agree with that.
restaurant or
Yeah.
something.
Well, I
I
will
mean,
say
that's-
through a specific plan, we have the opportunity to,
Yeah,
you
so
know,
I think
assign
that's where you do it.
regulations, so.
Yeah.
The other thing, I heard, you know, we're sitting here worried about what the community's gonna say.
Mhm.
I think you should take to the community the best plan and
Yeah.
just face up. I think the comment about property, that was before the housing got jammed down everyone's throat this last time.
Yep.
People are starting to see, people can now be told that if they don't look at an area like El Camino Real and find a way to create the density to absorb the housing, they're gonna get something shoved in the middle of their neighborhood. I mean,
SB9.
and it's, although it probably would have helped if the Olevenheim project had been approved, that would probably have gotten people's attention. There's been enough, I think, but I think that the bottom line is, whatever you come out with in terms of overlay, in terms of trying to go for height, makes sense, and don't try to design a plan that's designed to somehow go with what people used to vote on.
And someone mentioned earlier, show the community benefits, right? As part of that plan, right?
Well, what he's saying is just
Yeah.
don't compromise
Right.
the most, you know, the best plan from.
Make it work.
From a,
I mean,
yeah.
you know, so if you're gonna, it's just, I think, the worry about trying to bastardize it in some way that you're gonna sell it for a vote, I don't think that's gonna work. People in Encinitas are actually pretty smart, and they'll see that for what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Well, the goal would be to find the best plan is not necessarily a bastardized plan, but
Right.
that we can find the right balance.
I think what I keep hearing from everybody is flexibility. Let the market
Yeah.
dictate.
Yeah, I
Don't
definitely
get
heard
into
that.
dictating parking. You know, a range of densities, because as I mentioned, you just don't know what part of the cycle you're gonna finally get this approved, and maybe in multifamily will be in favor, maybe single family detached, maybe it'll be 2 micro units. You know, it's the market has a way of figuring out the best solution, and it's a lot smarter than all of us sitting here trying to to see into the future. So I think it's just I think the more flexibility. We've all got plenty of rules in California we got to follow. Can't even buy a gas lawnmower anymore. So let's try to let the market dictate.
Not to be too much in the weeds for a specific plan, but some interesting project up in LA that are building structured parking but designed for future housing, where you could strip off the speed ramps and then retrofit the parking structure for condos and multifamily. It's more expensive at the front end, but really cheap down the road once autonomous driving vehicles become more prevalent, or mass transportation becomes better, parking requirements become less, and then those projects can be converted into something that would be more residential oriented. But you kind of got you have the foundation for that conversion from day one. So maybe something in the specific plan would just focus on being super creative with design, construction materials at the front end.
Okay.
I've negotiated development agreements where we have those provisions that when those types of technologies become available, that we can opt into that type of a program.
Mhm.
But the concern I have with those types of requirements is that sometimes, because of the cost, it just pushes the goalposts of approval for
Right,
feasibility
right.
that many years down the road, and then a deal doesn't happen, right? So,
Yeah.
especially in retail, you kind of have a window, like if an owner of a retail center thinks that they want to redevelop, you have to start planning 7-8 years in advance and start burning off leases and
Right.
modifying your REAs and
Yeah.
things like that, right? There's a lot of constraints, and so, minimizing some of those hurdles, I think, can expedite the delivery of change. Yeah, so.
Got it.
But there's ways to definitely include that as an opt-in type of a program.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to be mindful and leave adequate time for public comments and input. Are there any kind of last thoughts, last input, comments you'd like to provide? And this is certainly not the last opportunity. I would really appreciate your continued involvement as we go through the project. I think your insight is very, very valuable and crucial for us to develop, a reasonable, realistic, balanced plan. So, anything else?
It's interesting. You had mentioned something about kind of creating a kind of a whole community within a community scenario, and it kind of reminded me of how the original shopping center concept was done, that everybody would come there and they basically live and do all of their life in that center. And it would have had a shopping center, it would have had parks, it would have had everything under a structure. And it ended up being a mecca for people to come in their cars later on.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to see that. But
It's probably what
you
they
can
thought Village
adapt
Park
that
would be.
somehow to today's work, a realization that'd be interesting.
Yeah, Mimi?
Yeah, I have a, I guess, more holistic kind of question and maybe a pointed question of what is that catalyst that would incite you to develop? So we've heard CVS came to you, or we've heard from the broader national, company that they're going through with this business plan. So it's that trickle down effect. And it seems like if that's going in, it seems like everybody's kind of waiting for something else to happen down the line, and that would help trigger you to decide whether to build or this other person to build. What is it that will make you not try to get ahead of it, but be
To redevelop.
to be that person,
Yeah.
to be that first person, that catalyst to start that change.
Eliminate all development fees. Just saying.
Yes.
We've so we're redeveloping our 18th Sears box right now, and my firm worked on the old Target that's now LA Fitness. We redeveloped the LA Fitness and put in the self-storage and the consignment furniture store. The reality is, it really each if you look at the Sears boxes we've redeveloped, they've turned into very different outcomes. Like one I'm working on right now, we're taking the existing structure, we've put a ground floor grocery store next to a soft goods retailer, I'm putting medical office on the second floor, and then I have a pet supply store going into the old auto center.
So the outcomes have been different. Were there commonalities to the impetus or the catalyst?
The underlying regulations and the market dynamic is ultimately what drove the outcome for the development. So
Right.
my answer to your question is, if there's a certified EIR for a specific plan,
Certainty. You want
and
certainty.
there's a code and a rule book to play by, that I know the rules of the game going in aren't going to change, that's what's going to incentivize me to invest money and time into redeveloping something. It's a portion of it is then, once that's in place, then I'm looking, okay, is there a CVS box? Is there a Sears box? Is there a vacant store, that just a location that continues to struggle, like the Aldi? Is Aldi going to succeed? How many times is that thing turned over, right? That'd be a great location for housing. You know what I mean? So then you start looking at the locations of where it could occur. But you need the certainty in place. You need the city to do the work, to take some of the arrows from the community, to be honest, because I, as a developer, don't want to be the one out there trying to do one Paseo again.
And you're going to get the arrows as the
And
developer.
anything else in response to Mimi's question?
Historically, I feel that, I'm a landscape architect, but historically I feel that mixing residential with commercial as an integral mix is historically not successful. But like Paseo 1, you separated it into two separate kind of areas. They're adjacent, which works. And that's something I think is very important to include in the specific plan. If you're going to include residential, make sure it's not competing.
Yeah, ground floor
with
retail is
parking and
challenging.
so forth.
Doing ground floor retail, you
Right.
definitely don't want to make that a requirement because it's, I mean, we've all seen the vacant storefronts of the ground floor retail that was just required to be built.
Such an afterthought.
And it had there were no tenants, there's no parking, there's no signage.
Right.
It's too shallow,
Bad
there's no
ceiling
bay
height.
depths, there's no ceiling height.
Yeah.
And a lot of multifamily developers just give it zero value and they
Yep.
just build it just to satisfy the
Yep.
requirement
Yep.
and they never lease it. So I agree, it's challenging. You can't do it everywhere.
Exactly.
So
And the
focus
other
on
thing-
horizontal mixed use.
Yep.
The other thing is, I think people tend to not like to go into parking structures
Mhm.
because typically the parking stalls are minuscule. They're not as large as in an open space. If we could be something that would be included to make the spaces large enough for actual vehicles to park there, that'd be more welcoming.
There aren't any SUVs in Encinitas though.
Yeah,
so that's-
right.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of move us to public. I saw a hand back here. I wanna make sure that you all have time to
Thorn in your
make.
side, you better
So I'm
save
a
5
business
years.
owner and a homeowner,
Uh-huh.
and I
You were
am
following
in the
it,
ECR
so-
corridor. And if there's gonna be a revisit of Measure T, unless the city already did this, I'd suggest polling the community to see what was the biggest negative for Measure T. And in a lot of cases, for at least people in my neighborhood, there was a feeling that all the housing requirements, the city, this is the view from the community, that the city was trying to fix their housing requirements by pushing everything on the ECR. And you know, I think that the community, if you wanted to do by exception a zoning height, but it's not gonna be 5, 6, 7 stories, that's more palatable to the community. And then not try to solve the city's housing problem all in the 3 quarters of ECR, which
Yep.
are, you know, the corner of Encinitas Boulevard and El Camino Real. That's, if you polled people, and that's the thing that people had a real problem with, was the height and the amount of units. And then the environmental impact report really didn't do a good service as to traffic mitigation. Using, you know, other areas outside of the San Diego area for your traffic counts didn't fly. There's too many people in this community that are either ex-planners, ex-engineers, ex-construction people. I mean, a lot of people stood up during the city council meetings on the environmental impact report. I mean, I myself read the whole environmental impact report because I'm in the business. But that's what you're up against in this community. So, you know, looking at Measure T is a great idea, but it may need to be modified from what it was originally.
Right,
If you
right,
wanted to
right.
pass a property
But at least
vote.
understanding it. Yep.
What's the aversion to the
Understood.
height along El Camino Real?
Like,
Why not 5 stories? Why not 7 stories?
because the people that bought, and I live east of Encinitas Boulevard, they want to preserve the residential feel of the community. That's why they didn't buy in that area to be in densification like being in
But
the
is it-
city. They're afraid we're gonna turn this into like a Huntington Beach, and the traffic.
May I ask a clarification? So is it the height that the aversion or the amount of housing?
It's a combination of both.
Okay.
It's a combination of both. Traffic is, I'll give you a perfect example. I live in the community behind Trader Joe's. I left at 2:30 to come here, and I got here at 3:05. That's 2.5 miles, all right? My office is on Saxony in the corporate center, and I moved our offices from Kearny Mesa to avoid sitting on the freeway for an hour, and it takes us a half hour in the morning to go that far. that's what everybody's really complaining about. I mean, it has gotten, and I've lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. I've watched it go from being 2 minutes to get downtown to now it's a half hour. It will get, I mean, people, it's just natural. I mean, to us, most of the people in my neighborhood, we all know that it's, you know, development is inevitable. It's properly managed development.
Understood.
So you don't end up with a totally citified type of community. That's what people are really worried about in my end of the area.
Understood. That's really helpful. Other public comments?
I think if you looked at the elevation, the grade, the topography, there might be areas where you could go with a higher elevation, you know, for your ceiling. You know, as you go down the corridor, there are elevation changes without housing right on behind the centers themselves.
Okay.
A lot of us still sit in the customers.
Very, very helpful.
Get them to deal with.
Other comments?
I think many of you have impressed the importance of Encinitas are pretty smart. They would like to do the most responsible thing. And I don't want to embarrass Brian, but he put a beautiful visual of Fox Point Farms back in the beginning when it was just being considered as a housing element site. And I don't remember any other developer putting up a visual of what they plan to see. And Brian's vision, I mean, he altered it for neighbors' accommodations and what neighbors wanted. But it was a beautiful vision that people had, and in the end, he had, you know, like 99% of the neighbors in the, you know, proximity to Fox Point Farms welcomed it. I mean, they didn't start that way, but because I think they had a vision and they saw Brian's willingness to work on the design, even if it started gorgeous, I think it's really important that we have a vision like that.
That's really helpful. Yeah, visuals are very helpful. Yes.
You know, just for another perspective also. So I grew up in Encinitas, and I remember when Regan Plaza went in.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I go anywhere else to shop. I live in Village Park, and I'll go anywhere but ECR to shop because it's horrible. And every time I see a new redesign, like, you know, redoing the frontage of all these places, I think, oh God, they're gonna do something better now, right? No, it's the same thing with like new colors or whatever it is. And I understand that retail is having a problem. I totally get that. And you're trying to do something to pull in people to make it more attractive. But you know, what I've heard you all talking about here today makes me so much more hopeful that it's actually going to get better. It's just not what I've been seeing for decades. For decades I've lived here and been like, oh God, please, something that makes it like I want to be here. Because I swear, I'll drive the half hour down to the lumberyard rather than shop on ECR. I mean, it's a nightmare.
Here, and I'll prove my point. I used to belong to Club Pilates in Encinitas downtown. I just re-upped my membership at the one in Solana Beach because it takes me less time to go to Solana Beach than it does to go.
It's a good data point.
I mean, that's what people here,
I'd
you
still
know,
go
think
down
about.
I'd still go down to Encinitas downtown. I'm delighted to see streetscape. I'm like, I am so excited to get down there and actually be able to move around down there. Because who wants to walk around? You can't even walk into any of the shopping centers on ECR.
Yeah.
Like if I walk across Mountain Vista, you can't walk into the Vaughn's shopping center there because there's no sidewalk. I can't send my kid down, you know, safely. I've heard that's a traffic thing too.
If the 3-story height limit stays, you'll never see the retail change. I'll tell you right now. If this height limit stays,
Yeah.
you can't justify getting rid of retail tenants, even if they're paying below market rents.
Put a sidewalk in.
Yeah, you can put a sidewalk in, but my point is, you're not going to see the change. You're going to continue to see lipstick on a pig until you can build 5 stories of residential.
Yep.
This is never going to pencil
If
otherwise.
it's actually residential,
Yeah,
I'd be into that.
yeah.
If it's 5 stories of retail,
Yeah.
then
It's
no.
never
Not
gonna
gonna-
It won't be
You know,
five stories of retail.
but,
Yeah.
and I appreciate her point and what, you know, part of this whole visioning that you're gonna go through this, we keep talking about structures and what's gonna happen, but the connectivity aspect,
Mhm.
that whole corridor is gonna be critical because
Yes, agreed.
the whole reason the rules are changing, housing's getting jammed down your throat. We're being told by CARB that we have to be out of our vehicles by 2030. It's all about greenhouse gas emissions. That's what VMT is all about.
Yeah.
You know, if a huge component of the specific plan is how are people gonna move around in the corridor from one place to another without a car?
That's a
And-
great point, and mobility and
Right,
connections and
absolutely.
linkages is a crucial part
And
of
if
it.
you create a visual community that's, you know, properly scaled, it's visually interesting, then you get more people wanting to walk in it or
Yeah.
bike in it than drive to it. So anyway, I think you're spot on about what you're saying about creating an experience, creating a place rather than just.
I've got my e-bike, I'll be happy to drive down there, give me somewhere to go.
Right,
Yeah.
we'll give you a lane to ride your e-bike in.
And when I
Right,
get
understand.
there, I don't wanna go to a restaurant where the parking is in front of my table. I don't wanna eat there.
And Brian, I think, you know, you and Jim have both brought up that whole neighborhood concept, and I mean, frankly, I think One Paseo is a really, really good example of that. If you put office and commercial and residential and open spaces and all these passive recreational areas in one space, you know, those people aren't getting in their car for 8 trips a day. They're getting in their car for 3 or 4 trips a day. They might not work at that office space, but they're probably going to dinner there, or vice versa. So you're not gonna see the traffic that you would see with that density in a purely residential project. And I think that's a big part of the educational component that needs to happen, you know, with the public here, that, hey, this is what it could look like, and this is how these people could live in here. They're not driving to go everywhere because we placed them where all those things already are.
And I agree 100%, but that was a 22-acre, $92 million clean canvas to start with. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
now we're talking about rebaking what we already have and going back to to Scott's point initially, where you've got to balance your debt service to lenders that don't want that to stop, and that income
Yep.
to convert it to what we're all trying to vision.
Yeah.
And that's the balance.
And that's why it works well as an overlay. Completely agree with the overlay concept. The city did the same thing with the housing element. If you choose to develop for the underlying zoning, great. You know, we considered both options on several of the properties that we're working on. So, you know, you have the option, and I think it can all work well in a specific plan
100%.
arrangement, yeah.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
So, I'm a neighbor of this lady here, and I have, I moved to Encinitas about 25 years ago this year, and, which I know is still a newcomer for some people. But I've spent a lot of time in other places and grew up in a different part of the country that was an extremely walkable neighborhood. My family had 1 car, we could make a tank of gas last a week. We could walk to church, the library, school, or we took a city bus to the high school. So I have a really different experience, and I'm still adjusting to living in the suburbs. And I've been to places where, you know, they have little shuttle buses that run along the commercial corridors where you can hop on and hop off, you know, instead of driving to each place. I'm trying to do my errands and walk just to get in some walking and exercise along the Encinitas corridor. I park one place and go down to the post office and go back and stop at Walgreens or whatever. And it, as Christina says, it's unpleasant, but I'm forcing myself to do it. I also will drive to places just to meet up with a friend for coffee because there's just not that many places. And it's and now I have a family member who, you know, has a walking issue, and so, you know, we can't walk the mile to the El Camino Real corridor because there's nowhere to sit and rest along the way for my family member. And then once you get there, there's still not that many places that are easy to walk around. I love the idea of a shuttle or something that you can just hop on and hop off. when we spent time in Christchurch, New Zealand, while my husband was doing a sabbatical, I rode the bus everywhere. I did everything for the family on the bus. They have a fantastic bus system. I realize people here are just not into buses, but you know, the seniors have free bus pass from 10 to 3 every day. The buses were full of seniors. It got them out of their houses. They were sociable. They went places. They met up with their friends. It was really an eye-opening experience to live without a car for 6 months. I really liked it. I missed it a lot. You know, I if things don't change here, and I can convince my husband to leave, I mean, I'd easily seek out a more walkable place. So I think there's lots of options. The hard part is probably going to be getting residents to accept some of them, but I think if you could, it's the experience that I think people are missing. And you know, they go to Europe and they come back and they rave about what a great time they had, but they never envisioned that, you know, you could have some of the same things right here. There's lots of people that live within a walking distance of the El Camino Real corridor, but there's not that many reasons to go. And since, you know, nobody does their banking in person anymore, and a lot of their retail shopping, then it need to be more businesses that people want to go to, and not just to buy stuff. I want to get out and meet up with people. Once the, you know, pandemic stuff is passed and taken care of, I'm eager to get back to meeting with people, or just spending time with my husband once he's retired. You know, to just go places. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what happens.
Thank you. One more here, and then you can close this out if that's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
I think one of the issues that the city needs to really look at is, what is the El Camino corridor for? Is it for people from San Elijo, Carlsbad, La Costa to get to the freeway, or is it for Encinitas residents to go shopping? I mean, I think that's one of the biggest issues, because, you know, we're a throughway to the freeway on all of our major roads. And I don't think that issue has been considered or dealt with. I don't have a solution to it. But, you know, what is the focus? Is the focus of redeveloping the El Camino corridor to make life better for Encinitas residents? Or is it to make life better for people driving through town? And that's the people who want to drive through town to get to the freeway, they don't want to see lane narrowing. They don't want to see wider bike lanes. They don't want to see lower speed limits, because we are a throughway to the freeway. And I think that issue has never been really grappled with in Encinitas, at least to my satisfaction.
Understood. No, it's a good perspective.
It may be a regional issue, but it still is an issue.
But it's a good perspective.
Well, I live off of Rancho Santa Fe Road. My office is right at Manchester, Encinitas Boulevard, and it sometimes takes me 10 minutes. But it's a regional issue. They put all the stop signs in, it doesn't stop them.
Yeah, I can't wait to build
I'm going to turn this to a comment here.
Yeah, just as all the conversation goes on in terms of walkability, I'm of an age where I don't have small children or anything, but I think one of the things to remember, this community has been largely grown out by families, and a lot of them are, somebody made the comment about SUVs. There are a lot of people who don't speak in some of these planning meetings, but they're mothers with 2 or 3 kids, fathers with 2 or 3 kids that are trying to get to services or get to a school or something else. And
in the most efficient way possible.
And I just think it's important as you think about this, everything from the way in which the streets are designed to how you're going to close down parking, or you view this as, you've got to really think about who we're serving, and that group is one that I think it's important to the community, and I think they don't show up in the conversation.
It's true. It's very true.
Yeah, just sit in front of Trader Joe's.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, just sit in front of Trader Joe's for a morning and see who comes in and out.
That's your demographic.
There
right
you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys. I'm gonna draw us to a close. I really appreciate your time today. I know you guys have your day jobs that are pretty busy, so thank you. And thank you to the public for being here as well and listening.
Not a problem for me, but.
Hi there.
No problem.
Thanks for your comment.
Whatsoever. I would, like I said, I would welcome your guys' continued involvement. I will make a point.
Nice to meet you, Scott.
How are you?
I'm well, how are you?
I think that shopping center lipstick looks really good.
Thank you.
My card.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah, just resigned like 4 weeks.
Yeah, when Sioux Plantation went around, like, what the hell's going on there? And then you guys started putting up the nice white facade. You got that.
Keith Pittsburgh.